Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my Kerbal Space Program NASA series, where I'm continuing to train Kerbals in the art and science of supersonic aircraft flight. Which, apart from getting them their Final Frontier ribbons for just boring, dumb roleplay reasons, it's flying these things has given me an opportunity to experiment with max Q and throttle points. Not that, so long as you're not trying to pull some really insane maneuvers, you're generally not going to over-G the aircraft and lose anything, but it's just kind of interesting and important to figure out how this works, provided you can bring the Kerbal back safely. And unfortunately at this stage, with the back half of the aircraft gone, most of the weight is now on the nose wheel, so any attempt to engage the brakes causes the whole thing to pitch up and try to dig the nose into the ground. Surface velocity is still above the impact tolerance of this pod, so I've got to try and ride this out, and then I lose a wing until it gets slow enough to safely stop. And so now things have gotten really dire because I've got one wing attempting to roll the entire remainder of the aircraft over that I have to constantly fight against while keeping things balanced on the nose wheel. But as the terrain levels out, things just go disastrously wrong. Thankfully, the stall and subsequent crash slowed the pod down enough to get below the impact tolerance and safely bring this guy back. Takes a moment to commemorate the event, appropriately titling X-15 Crash Site. A plaque for the ages, anything you can walk away from. While he destroyed the aircraft, he completed his training in the most Kerbal way possible. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of the plane left to recover. This next flight, we decided to be a little more cautious and fly 2 half loops to change our vector 180 degrees without getting too far off the runway. It's basically an Immelman turn. And this time we kept enough reserve fuel that we could adjust our speed on the way in, not have to worry about complete glider approach, and didn't get nearly as far from the Space Center as on previous flights. Bob Kerman becomes the first to be able to claim a perfect landing in the X-15 test aircraft. With that narrow landing gear track, the chutes are pretty much necessary for stopping. Hitting the brakes at anything above like 20 meters a second tends to really upset it, even with the nose brakes disabled. But with our messing around with supersonic aircraft, rocket planes out of the way, we transition the base to the authority of the Kerbal Space Agency, with NACA having lost their mandate, and go for our first orbital flight. Pretty simple single-stage booster. If you stack enough fuel on these things and put a small enough payload, you can generally get away with a lot more than you'd expect in a Kerbal Space Program. It's a lot more forgiving than, say, Orbiter or even realistic Solar System Kerbal Space Program, which I thought about using for this series, but I messed around with it and there's just so many different things I have to tweak for compatibility, and what it basically amounts to is more time burning and climbing and a lot of effort just so I can trim out more footage and fill my hard drive up faster. So we are sticking with the good old Kerbal system we know and love. Ditch the booster stage and engage the main drive on this Moho spacecraft. Finishing a circularization burn, which our eccentricity ended up not quite what I was aiming for because the differential thrust of the 2 stages, but it's no big deal. Still got him into orbit, still accomplished our goals. then it becomes a matter of just taking the scientific observations that we can, float over and collect the data from that was recorded on the way up. Pretty much every science mod, pretty much every mod that adds science parts, they have gone in and added the module for collectible data at this stage, which is really convenient. The early days of messing with like D-Magic, orbital science, which is where those magnetometers come from, you had to make sure you recovered the craft intact, which I'm trying to bring as much of this thing back as I can just for cost reasons. The real Mercury craft was basically just that pod you see coming back. Go over some EVA shenanigans and sightseeing at 4 times time acceleration. Floating around. Just a lot of goofing off in orbit on this first flight. What can I say? It's a first orbital flight. Not really anything all that interesting. Just nice to hang out and enjoy the view. Admire the application of my KSA emblem. Get a real good view of the textures on that Thunder Aerospace life support pack. I have a Newtonian physics test. With our fun in space over with, it's time to head back home. Got more than enough parachutes to bring this thing back safely without worrying about smashing anything off. Which again, that's a concession to gameplay. I do have all the science in that pod as a backup, but it's all some pretty expensive equipment, so I'd like to bring as much of it back home as I could. This stage becomes glaringly obvious. We'll be making it back safely. Chute deployment. And into the water. And take a magnetometer reading while we're here. With that contract fulfilled, it's time to go spend some of that science. The electrics being a very important thing to have. Also switch for unmanned probes because our next task is to try and put a communication satellite network into orbit. I'm not going to show the whole deal in this video just because it's a lot of tedious maneuvering, but I got the only propulsion on this system is that SRB and the satellite zone propulsion unit, which I think I used the that orbital achievement device from KW Rocketry is the engine I'm using there. Pretty efficient, not as efficient as the LV909, I think, but it does have an alternator, which is useful. I will elaborate on this though. On your first satellite in a network, unless you have a Kerbal somehow assisting in its deployment, it's very critical that you get into a stable orbit almost as soon as possible. You can always wait for your resonance to come around to sort your periaps out the way you want. But if you dip below the horizon or get out of range of your omnidirectional antennas, you're pretty much just at this in 0.24. You're spending money to throw big rocks in the ocean or on land, depending on where it comes down. Trying to aim for a 400-kilometer orbit on this one. There's no particular reason for that. I just picked an altitude that I liked and went for it. Worked out in the end because at 400 kilometers you can get a 1-hour resonant orbit, which means your satellite will orbit 6 times for every revolution of Kerbin. So it only takes basically 1 day, or it takes 1 orbit to get the Space Center back underneath you, is what I'm trying to say, in order to readjust your orbit. experimenting with the remote tech flight computer. I have used it before, but I've never had very good results. In node execution mode, it's basically just mechjeb without the ability to make your nodes automatically. So I tend to try to fly these a little more hands-on. So it was a neat little experiment. Might play with it later, especially if I have something to bring back. Like if I'm trying to bring a probe. If you're trying to bring a probe into orbit, say around Duna or another planet, and you're not going to have line of sight to your communications network, it will still help you, allow you to perform a maneuver. But at this stage, I've got my orbit stable, got my orbital period down to 1 hour exactly. Unfortunately, it's just pretty easy to get out of range of the Space Center at this point. It being the only satellite up there. But setting it up for local control, aiming one dish at Duna, or one dish at the Moon, one dish at Minmus, and the other being reserved for whatever active vessel you might be flying. These are basically just local control satellites, but they'll pretty much handle anything within the Kerbal system. That out of the way, we aim to fulfill another contract by going into a high Kerbal orbit. Not necessarily going to establish a stable orbit. We just want to get the apoaps high enough to get high above Kerbal data. The contract we've got selected here is just to transmit any science back from space, from high, well, space in general. There's no altitude setting for this one. This being untapped territory as far as scientific observation goes. Gonna pick up whatever goodies we can while we're here. Those magnetometers really remind me of the ones on Voyager and Pioneer spacecraft, which is probably what they were going for. But those were some interesting pieces of kit. If I remember correctly, the boom was made out of telescoping fiberglass segments, and they're very, very light, but they could just extend to just ridiculous lengths versus what they were stowed. And since I have finally figured out how to make Kerbal attachment system work in 0.24 64-bit, D-Magic Orbital Science integrates with the Universal Storage mod, so there are magnetometers and other science modules that fit into that service module kind of construction unit they give you, and they look a ton better than this kind of cobbled together thing I've got. But this is what I had to deal with at the time, so it seemed nice enough. Not necessarily the most attractive spacecraft, but more than functional. This time I did not keep that engine attached. Figured I was coming up at a higher velocity. If I happen to lose that engine or the fuel tank, imagine things were going to go pretty badly wrong very quickly, so. And not paying attention to where I was bringing him down, I almost set him right on the side of a mountain, which no SAS in the world is strong enough to have kept him from tumbling down that and ending his poor little life. Sometimes you just get lucky. Him with Bill safely returned. Take note of all the ribbons he's been bestowed upon. Did not get the stable orbit ribbon. Still didn't get enough science to unlock any more tiers, but got high above Kerbal. Oh wait, have to recover the spacecraft. I had sent him on EVA to collect the surface data from the mountain region, because that's usually a pretty hard one to hit. There aren't very many of them. The only one I consider harder to hit is the Badlands, because there's just 2 very small biomes called Badlands, with the Badlands designation on Kerbin. Decided to finish off this tier. Bunch of useful stuff in these 2 nodes. And it's time to put that satellite network to test by orbiting a mapping satellite. At this point it was like 2 o'clock in the morning and I was fat fingering my record keys, so I didn't catch the launch, but got the important part: mapping the surface of Kerbin with a low resolution radar altimetry scan. Pretty meager science reward for all the effort, but I think ScanSat maps are fairly cool all around anyway. And at this stage I've been trying to avoid all the rescue Kerbal stranded in orbit missions, just because there's nothing that really coincides in real life to them, and that and the fact that I've got pretty limited technology, so anything I build for rescue is going to be pretty cobbled together and janky anyway. However, I saw a contract pop up to rescue Chuck Kerbin from orbit, and could not pass up the opportunity to have my very own Chuck Yeager in my program. And at this point I was panicking because I didn't have my staging set correctly and had to manually activate that engine. But I did the best I could. Made the jankiest, ugliest spacecraft you can imagine. Basically an unmanned probe core on top of a Mark I pod with a couple parachutes attached. And the panic takes over again because it seems like remote tech makes these antennas exceedingly difficult to click on. Either that or it's a 64-bit bug, but I seem to remember this going back all the way back to 0.22, one of the last times remote tech was stable enough to play with regularly. I was almost ready to give up because that the dipole antenna doesn't have hardly any range, and then, very last moment, I get lucky and connect with an activate command. Carefully planning our rendezvous. It was a lot trickier than I was expecting it to be, because this is the first rescue mission I've ever flown, and I've noticed that even setting them a Kerbal as a target doesn't necessarily make them appear in your overview. And against the vast backdrop of space, a tiny Kerbal is pretty much invisible. So I get close enough and burn off any excess relative velocity. He still shoots back out of physics range. But all in all, not bad for a direct descent rendezvous. It's not the most efficient way to do it, but because of TAC life support, I was aiming for the most rapid rendezvous I could make. Efficiency be damned. Trying to switch and see if it'll get me to the Kerbal. Unfortunately, I've got to readjust our rendezvous to bring him within physics range before I can switch to him manually. Get that encounter down. Finally get close enough to switch control to the Kerbal, and even after I did that, trying to find the spacecraft itself was a chore. Which, his life support upon loading into physics range was food, water, oxygen, and electricity were all at 0. So I was kind of in a time crunch. Thankfully, everything worked out just fine. Able to get him aboard. Deorbit. and bring him home. After safely returning him to Kerbin, he is added to the crew roster, and I think I'm going to make him Chief Test Pilot.